can email us, news@radio1190.org, with your questions. And on the phone right now is probably one of the biggest, I guess you could say, players in this congressional race. This congressional race here in Congressional District 2, which includes Boulder and most of Larimer County, is really important because it's competitive due to the redrawing of the district lines. And you can say the same thing about Congressional District 4, mentioning that earlier in Longmont. But on the phone right now is the Republican candidate for Congress, Eric Weissmann. Eric, welcome to the show.
Nice to be with you.
So, just really quickly to start everything off, just introduce yourself to the audience. Who are you and why are you running for Congress?
Thanks for having me, and thanks for that question. This is an extraordinary time in our country. When we look at the time that we're going to be on the phone today, about 20 minutes, we'll add $40 million to our national debt in that time frame. When we look at what happened this morning with our jobs report, it's a extraordinarily frightening time to be starting a career or to be raising a family and looking at that economic uncertainty. I'm a business person. I've never been a candidate before. I've never held any kind of government office before. I come at these problems from the perspective of a person who's been in the private sector, who's started companies, who created jobs, more than 100 of them right here in Colorado, and who is taking that business perspective to Washington. So why am I running? I'm running because I am fed up with what's going on here. Our free enterprise system, our personal freedoms, these are slipping away from us, and they need to be supported. They need to be defended, and it's time for ordinary citizens from the private sector to step up and take on these enormous challenges.
So looking at your time as a businessman, and again, you mentioned the job reports from May, which were positive, meaning positive job growth, but at the same time, it was very slow, much slower than anticipated. How does your time as a businessman in the state of Colorado qualify you to be Congress, and just bring your ideas as to how you can help make that job numbers much higher going into 2013 if you're to be elected to Congress?
So that's a great question. Why does being from the business world or from the private sector qualify you on these economic policy issues? In looking at what this current administration and in fact some previous administrations of both parties and Congress members of both parties have done, it's clear that they don't understand the impacts of their action on the private sector. It's extraordinary, the stories that I hear when I talk to business people around our district, and from my own experience of the way in which government stands in the way of getting things done. One of the biggest ways that I think doesn't get quite enough focus is in the area of regulation. Regulation costs our economy about $1.8 trillion a year. That's $1.8 trillion that wasn't spent productively, but instead was spent on regulation. When we think about all the people that wanted jobs and couldn't get them and all the growth we didn't get, having that huge cost, that huge waste of that $1.8 trillion, if we can bring that down and understand what those do to businesses, that helps make those problems look more solvable. So it's from the perspective of seeing what these actions translate into on the ground and back here in Colorado. That's why that's a unique.
So dig in for me a little bit of, you mentioned the $1.8 trillion that are spent on regulation. Give me a main example or a couple of examples of why is there so much money being spent on regulation?
Well, there is almost nothing in our economy that isn't regulated. Mm-hmm. Some parts of it are regulated far more than others. And if you think about what are some of the most regulated industries in the United States, you think about banking, you can think about airlines, you can think about healthcare. These are areas where we've got some of the most troubled sectors of our economy also being some of the most regulated. I was visiting a mortgage lender who told me that he has several employees just handling new paperwork that has been implemented in the last 2.5 years. And these employees are dealing with this paperwork instead of making loans. That makes it harder to get a loan, makes it harder for them to write loans, and if somebody can't get a loan to buy a house, then you won't have people employed who can build that house. It just drags out the whole economy, each piece of this. I talked to a guy who's got a business that sells commercial air conditioning units, and his fleet hit a certain size, and he was ordered to buy a propane truck. Well, the propane truck with the propane tank, the tank is large enough that he can't carry the products that he sells. So he had to buy this to comply with the regulation, but it's not even useful in his business. And it's story after story after story of things where the policymakers and the regulators just don't get it. They just don't understand what the impacts are.
So let me try to understand your position on regulation, and tell me if I'm wrong on this. You, as far as regulation goes, I would imagine that you would be in favor of I guess what you could say reasonable type of regulation, meaning, for example, my view is that because it seems like the Republicans and the Democrats seem to portray each other on the other side of the regulation spectrum. Democrats say that Republicans just want a complete laissez-faire economy, and complete laissez-faire led to the Great Depression. And the Republicans say that the Democrats just want to regulate essentially everything, and this is going to just strangle our business growth. Are you more of in the middle ground, or are you a little bit more free market, more hands-off, as opposed to hands-on?
Well, I'm certainly more of a free market, hands-off. I start with that orientation, but let me talk specifically about some policies that I propose. And I actually have a paper on this on my website, and my website is ericweissmann.com with 2 S's and 2 N's in Weissmann, and this paper is located under issue papers. I propose an act called the EARN Act, Ease America's Regulation Now, and it has a few components. One of the components is a sunset. So when you have a regulation after 10 years, it would go away or need to be reauthorized. So you need to go through the process of public comments and all the other things that have to happen. So you don't have things that stay on and an ever-increasing cumulative burden. Another is an economic impact issue. So an independent and nonpartisan group would assess the economic impact of each regulation, and the proposing agency would need to couple that with a reduction a revision to another regulation or repeal of another regulation with an equal or greater economic impact. So we can have the regulation of our economy that is of the highest priority to our citizenry and get rid of the stuff that's deadwood and that doesn't add anything to it. And one of the other most important pieces is that there needs to be accountability in regulation. So my EARN Act proposes that major regulations, those with 100 million or more of impact, would need to be ratified by the Congress. I think it's appalling that these regulations happen by people who aren't even appointed, they're not elected, and there's no accountability to them. Those people don't have to go back to their districts and hear about the impacts of it. So Congress needs to step up and ratify or reject proposed major regulations.
And I'm sorry, continue.
I was going to summarize that none of these proposals could be characterized as a let's go to the wild west with no regulation.
Right, because that's one of the fears that I hear, especially on the left.
Yeah, yes, I think there's certainly a place for regulation. I mean, there's certainly a place for government in our society. When that gets overdone and heavy-handed, that's when it turns into a burden instead of a benefit. And when government protects our rights from one another, when government ensures a level playing field, those things are constructive for Americans. When government oversteps those bounds, that's when they're destructive for Americans and hurt both our freedom and our economic security.
So when I look at money and I see the money in politics that's going on, and you mentioned this a lot all over your website, taking a look at it, you accuse Jared Polis, and I'm basically just and most of Congress, of